you for joining us today for this online webinar on the Kirtland's warbler. We would like to start this webinar with a brief land acknowledgement for the lands on and near the Oak Ridges Moraine. We acknowledge that Indigenous peoples have had and continue to have presence and deep connection with the lands on and near the Oak Ridges Moraine, a part of what is known to the Indigenous peoples of North America as Turtle Island. These lands are the territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Chippewas of Georgina Island, Brahma, and Beausoleil, and of the Mississaugas of Alderville, Curve Lake, Hiawatha, and Scugog Island, the First Nations of the Williams Treaties. We would like to thank them and other Indigenous peoples for sharing this land with us. Indigenous peoples have been subjected to colonial oppression and injustice, which continues to this day. The Oak Ridges Moraine Land Trust acknowledges that the first step to reconciliation is recognizing Indigenous peoples and their inherent rights to the land, which will ensure that we are creating a better future by strengthening our relationship with them and the land. Our land trust endeavors to honor the land and its treaties by ensuring healthy ecosystems that thrive forever. We recognize that working together with Indigenous peoples to include ecological traditional knowledge systems moves us towards an equitable and sustainable future. So what is a land trust? We are a charitable organization dedicated to ecological protection. We receive land easement donations. We can either buy or receive donated land that we can own, or we can negotiate conservation easement agreements with landowners, in which the landowners still own the land, but we help them protect it, and that protection is forever, no matter how many landowners come after them. So landowners do experience tax benefits if they negotiate conservation easements with us. And all protection, whether it's a nature reserve that we own or a conservation easement agreement with a landowner, that is mandated protection. So nothing can really overrule that. It's protection beyond legislation. So currently we protect 5,269 acres, over 67 properties. A few of these properties are new as of 2022 and 2023. So all of these properties we protect across the Oak Ridges Moraine help promote climate change resiliency and protect species at risk habitat. And we also promote biodiversity and environmental heritage by protecting all of these properties. So why do we do it? As I said before, we like protecting healthy ecosystems and species at risk habitat. And we want future generations to be able to experience the beauty of the ecosystems we have today and all the species we have today, not just species at risk. So this is a map of the Oak Ridges Moraine Land Trust properties as of 2022. As of 2023, we would have a few more dots on this, but you can see the Oak Ridges Moraine is the light green, long blob of land across the green belt from Peel to Northumberland. And the yellow dots here are our conservation easement agreements. So those are landowner properties in which we help them protect their land. The red dots are our nature reserves that we own. And the one lone little purple dot is a joint ownership that we have. So you can see our properties that we help protect stretch all the way across the Oak Ridges Moraine. If you're interested in getting a little bit more involved with us, you can become a member or donate, volunteer, and join our events. As of March 21st, 2023, we have two upcoming events. On March 28th, we have our last webinar of the season. That is Pollinator Palooza with Canadian author Lorraine Johnson, and that one won't be recorded. On May 23rd, we have an action day. We have a garlic mustard removal in Schomburg at one of our private nature reserves. But you can follow us online on Instagram or Facebook, or just check out our website on our events page to see what's coming up. We do have more things in the works.
Thank you for joining us tonight. The Kirtland Warbler, I guess I should share my screen so you have something to look at besides me. The Kirtland Warbler, about, oh gosh, what was it now? A year and a half or 2 years ago, we were approached about this new project about bringing Kirtland Warbler back to Ontario. And my boss, Sue, who's on the call, was like, what? And I'm like, oh yes, we have to do this. This is so exciting. This is an endangered bird. It's rare. Let's get in on this. It'll be so exciting. And so here we are, and I'll give you a little bit more information at the end, but we've just secured our first Kirtland Warbler property that will be restored in Ontario just for these birds. So it's pretty exciting. We've come a long way, but we've got a long way to go. And it's a really exciting journey. And I'm going to give you a little background about the Kirtland's warbler and why bringing it back to Ontario is such an epic thing to do. It's not just about the bird, even though the bird is a pretty sweet one to see for all the birders out in the crowd. But the habitat and all the initiative behind it, it's a really incredible thing to be part of. So the Kirtland's warbler is the bird of fire. That's what it's known as. It's also, if you're a birder in Ontario, it's that uber rarity. Until last summer, you were lucky if you ever saw Kirtlands because they were so few and far between. So here's a cute little drawing down in Michigan, and I've noticed there's a few people in the crowd from Michigan, so you're probably like, Kirtlands, we see them all over the place. They've been bringing Kirtlands back for a while, and I'll talk a bit about that. And this is one of the drawings they do. They do a Kirtland warbler calendar that the kids, submit their photos, and it goes into a calendar and it gets distributed. And this is one of the pictures, and it shows kind of the bird and what its call is, and we'll listen to that, and also that it's the bird of fire. So we'll learn a bit about that. So a little history about this neat, teeny little bird, the warbler. It is one of North America's rarest songbirds. It was down to less than 500 individuals in the 70s and 80s. At one point in Michigan, I think they were down to 176. It's got a very restricted range, so that's a really low number. There were still some around, but it got really bad. So why that happened is it's a specialist. It's a bird of fire. It breeds in very special habitat that is around after a forest fire, traditionally, or an indigenous-led controlled burn, because they did that prior to settlement. There was the use of fire by indigenous communities throughout this area as well. However, along came settlement and colonization and development, and let's not allow the indigenous communities to practice any of their practices and that horrible treatment that we did to get rid of their traditions and their culture. And we started to lose all this wonderful habitat that was quite common. And with that, a lot of the species, including the Kirtlands, their species went down, their numbers when they were they're listed, or in the case of the Kirtlands, it was endangered. So the first Kirtland's warbler, let's give a guess in the chat. Does anyone know who might have found the Kirtland's warbler? Let's see if it's that obvious. Anyone? Who do you think? What's the name of the guy that first discovered the Kirtland's warbler? Put it in the chat and see if anyone gets it right. Charles Pease. Oh, maybe I'm wrong. I thought it was a guy named Dr. Kirtland. So Mike, you might have to correct me. I understood that it was a fellow named Kirtland. Maybe he was the first one. The first one wasn't found on land. It was found offshore. So the Kirtlands do migrate to their winter breeding grounds, and the first one was discovered offshore. The first breeding one and the first habitat, and I wrote this down because I am horrible with numbers, but the breeding grounds, how they bred in this very unique ecosystem, was first discovered in 1903. It was endangered. It was put on the endangered list, I believe, in the 60s, and in Canada was when we brought the species at risk legislation in later on. But the good news is that it was recently delisted in the States. They have recovered their populations down in Michigan and Wisconsin to the point where it was eligible to be delisted. That's good. It is still endangered in Canada. We'll learn why. So here's its range. And as you can see, it's extremely specific. So there's a hot spot, and that's kind of at the top part of Michigan there. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but you can see their big red blob. And then there's scattered areas through Michigan, and they migrate down in the Bahamas. Occasionally, there's been a few records of overwintering grounds in Dominican, Mexico. I think Florida was one. That doesn't represent an extension of the range. It's probably just a bird that got lost. But all of them, virtually all of them, go down to the Bahamas every winter, and that's where they they spend their winter. The reason why they go down to the Bahamas is it's the habitat that they use up here is very similar down there. So in the Bahamas, the disturbance isn't fire. It's more, big, huge storm surges. Sometimes there is fire, or it's human disturbances. And they do nest in pine trees down in the Bahamas as well, but that's their core breeding ground. But the threat to them in the past and the current threats that exist to them, none of them are really looked at as being a Bahama problem. It's a North American Great Lake problem. So the recovery efforts are focused up here, but they are still doing research down in the Bahamas about that and trying to get a better understanding of what they're spending time down. If you've ever been fortunate to hear the Kirtlands, they have a very loud song. So when they're on their breeding grounds, they're very easy to find. When they're not, they're really hard to find. So in the Bahamas, they're hard to find. They're in very tight shrubby areas, and because they're not singing, it's a bit harder to kind of figure out what they're doing down there, but they are doing work. But generally, the issues with what caused them to nearly go extinct and the recovery efforts are all focused up here in the breeding grounds. So a little biology about them. A really stunning bird, so bluish gray, bright yellow bellies on the males. They have a white eye ring that's broken or up and down crescents, depending on who describes it. And they have a little black mask on the males, and you can see that up there. As I mentioned, they're a habitat specialist. They're very, very particular. I call them like the picky birds. So when they get the right vegetation, they can be very dense. So there's been records of up to 100 males per square mile when the right vegetation is there. And because their habitat is so limited, it can get quite concentrated. Pretty good for an endangered bird, but that's how, I don't want to use the word, but basically desperate they are for the right habitat because they're that picky. So we'll look at that. They're very nomadic. They move around. I mean, look at this beautiful bird on the right side. Thank you, Diane Duran, for lending us your pictures because, wow, what a stunner. So they were originally thought to only nest in jack pine forests that were between the age of 5 to 23 years. That was kind of the extremes. And what created those was there was traditionally fires, and I'm going to use the numbers because, again, I can't remember numbers very well. So in the Great Lakes area, a catastrophic ecological fire, which is different than it's actually part of nature. Fires are so important to so many ecosystems and to everything involved with them. But a massive fire, we'll call it, not catastrophic, happened about every 60 years. And it would burn on average, let me get this straight, 85,420 hectares, which is over 210,000 acres. That's a massive forest fire. It would definitely be in the news if it was still happening every 60 years. We'd see that, and it would move around. After that fire, the ecosystem that bounced back, and remember, this is like tens of thousands of years or more of adapting to fires that happen every 60 years. It was commonplace. Like, we think, oh, it's awful, it's terrible, but all of the species associated with those, they're used to it. They need it. They thrive on that fire disturbance. And then we came along and as settlers and stopped it. So after the natural fires, about 50% of that massive area that was burned would be in jack pine. Jack pine's known as a fire species. So if you, and I actually have one over there, I should have grabbed it to show you, but if you ever seen the pine cones of them, yes, I keep pine cones in my kitchen, who doesn't? The resin has to be heated up to about 120 degrees Celsius around there in order for it to open and release the seeds that stay inside that cone. So if you look at your typical kind of white or red pine cone, you can actually get to the seeds, but on a jack pine, it's almost sealed shut. So it needs hot, hot, hot to be able to release the seeds for the next generation. So when a fire comes along, it's all about the jack. And it's like their time to shine, as well as some other species. And they really flush up big after a fire. And so that was about 50% of those massive areas was jack pine. And the density of them was just insane. They were just coming up everywhere. Now that we got involved, the settlers, the average fire is every 773 years. So we went from every 60 years through every 773 years do we see a forest fire like that. You hear about some of the accidental ones, but we rush to put them out. The average area burned, so if you remember, originally it was over 85,000 hectares. Now the average is about 6,300 hectares. So we have a significant loss in that post-fire habitat that was available in this area. And the jack pine, after those few fires that do happen, it drops to only about 37% coverage. So it's a completely different composition, if you will, of plants afterwards. So we have this gorgeous little bird that went, yeah, it's our turn to shine. And it would just move around. And because these massive forest fires would set back these huge areas and flush them with new growth every 60 years, all they had to do was just move around and wait for the next fire and move and move. So it worked out great. Now we're looking at 773 years to wait. So their wonderful ever-present habitat is all of a sudden not available. And on top of it, the young pine oak communities that were typical of very sandy soil, well, they cut them all down. They tried to grow agriculture, realized that sand and agricultural and open space didn't really work well. So the winds blew and there was blow sands. Oh, panic, let's destabilize it by planting as many rows of plantations that we can. And so those areas that weren't settled, they were planted with these plantations and they were let to grow huge. So all of a sudden, this lucrative, everywhere, readily available habitat for, in particular, this bird is gone. So therefore, the population plummeted. As the trees grow bigger, what happens is, so they nest in the lower branches and the vegetation on the ground, and the lower branches of those young trees helps protect them. But as they grow, the composition underneath the trees changes and the branches get higher up and they lose that protection. So they just move on to the next site. But there wasn't that many sites left. When they're in these really unique post-fire habitats, their diets they're generally insectivores. However, blueberries, it's a very important part of their diet later on in the season. So they also, their role in the ecology, because they weren't discovered till late and because they were so rare, even though they've been studied a lot, their impact on, like, everything has a role in ecology. Their impact wasn't really well understood because their populations were so decimated. But the one thing they did say that they were probably integral in spreading blueberries and obviously controlling insect populations like all the birds. But blueberries are a very important part of their diets, but they also eat things like aphids, flies, grasshoppers, any source of protein that they can find while foraging through their unique little habitat. So, as I mentioned in the bird of fire, here's a habitat that could be recently burned, and this is what almost you'd see after a fire. And if you've ever seen a fire or a forest after a fire, you probably go, oh yeah. But a couple of years, the more jack pines would come up, and they'd be much more dense in their distribution. But you still get these open breaks like you see here. We also get flushes of like sweet fern, the blueberries, these fire-dependent things that come up, and those were associated with the Kirtlands. It was like, yeah, everybody have a party because there was a big fire. It's totally different now, but it was a really, really important part. It still is of ecology. Now, where those fires were happening on that kind of 60-year rotation was very common in our area, where you have the glacial deposits associated with the Great Lakes. So you had very sandy soils, and with that became very dry areas that were then prone to fires, and that's the adaptation of that ecosystem. And that includes the Oak Ridges moraine. So here's a little female. You can see they're not quite as bright as the males that I showed you earlier, but and the mask isn't present. You can see it very faintly, but they're still a beautiful little bird. They nest on the ground, little cup-shaped nests, and they use pine needles, so it's a good thing they like pine forests. They actually will use deer hair. I know a lot of people like to leave out dog hair and stuff like that, but you know, they got it sorted out on their own. They can find natural sources, sedges, grasses. The understory that's very important in that new kind of post-fire ecosystem, and they make a nice, happy little nest. They can breed or have two broods, if you will, twice a year, if it's a good year. The babies are born like a lot of birds, not like the cute little killdeers that come out fluffy and running around. They're pretty much helpless, featherless, weird looking things. But it doesn't take long for them to fledge. And so that what enables them in the right conditions to actually have two sets of babies a year or two broods. Finding these nests is pretty tough. All right. So as I mentioned, they were always known and always studied as being jack pine specialists, which meant they only breed in jack pine forests because that was the dominant one, and that's where they found them. And in Michigan, where they were started the recovery efforts, that's exactly what was going on. And then they found later on that the populations in Wisconsin were using red pine. And red pine was just as important as jack pine. And as you can see from the red pine on the screen, they also have that lower branches. And you have that understory vegetation, which is really important to them. And so this was suitable habitat too. It just so happened there were so few of them left when they started the recovery efforts that there was a lot of jack pine forest. They just assumed that's what it is. But once the population got big enough to start kind of expanding its range out of that very minimal, oh my gosh, they're almost extinct range, they learned that they can adapt to red pine. Now, why this is really important is a lot of the management for them that happened in Michigan. So rather than just growing trees and burning them and growing trees and burning them, we can actually harvest trees. So they do an early harvest. So it allows for a really interesting mix of sustainable forestry. So we use wood products every day. When I'm hiking with kids, I always point out how important trees are in our everyday use. And I think in the pandemic, we saw how important tree products were when all the shelves of toilet paper went bare. So your toilet paper comes from forests. your houses, your furniture, a lot of the wood and that, your paper, everything comes from forests. So if we can have a sustainable source of wood and wood products that not only doesn't harm birds, it actually helps the birds. So rather than a complete fire, you can do a young harvest at say 23 years or maybe a bit later if you have a big enough rotation, which is what they're doing in Michigan, and have wood products and help the Kirtlands and all the other associated species. Now, why that's important with this adaptation or whatever it is with red pine that they've done, maybe it's been there all along and we just didn't see it, is that jack pine's not really a very lucrative wood. It's not a great wood at any size. So the value from a forestry perspective and the uses is very minimal. But red pine, it's got a higher value, it's got better uses. And so it's a bit more appealing if you have these massive areas that you want to restore to say to people, to the foresters, hey, here's a source of sustainable, great wood. It's got a value to it, and you're helping an endangered species. So there's that aspect of this whole restoration, and then they've done it very successfully down in Michigan. We can have forest products and really cute, awesome birds. So it's a win-win. And the red pine's a much better forestry product that we can do on a cycle than the jack pine. Hopefully that makes sense. There is questions and answers. So thanks, Mike. I'm just looking at them. Okay. Thank you for clearing that up. Excellent. If anyone wants the clarification, it wasn't actually Kirtland. So thank you, Mike, for sorting that out. I'm going to go to my source on that and sort them out. So here we have the red pine. There we go. This is comparing the typical stand. So 5-day years depends on growth rates of a jack pine on the top left and then a red pine on the bottom. And this is taken at the Packard site. And this was the site where we had, they estimate 5 or 6 males singing on territory all year at the Packard site, and it was all red pine. And the picture up on the top is one of the Michigan restoration sites, which is all jack pine. So slightly different, but the birds apparently aren't that picky. So that's a good thing. So we have these unique kind of fire disturbed. I talked about the frequency of them and the size, but we're in Southern Ontario. So we've got this huge Great Lakes area. We knew this happened, but in Southern Ontario, where we're from, and I think a lot of people on the webinar, these are discoveries of these sand plain pine barrens, early successional pine oak forests. They were around for sure. We don't really have the historic mapping that you can see down in the States, but we still have some records. The Oak Ridges Moraine itself, which is how we got involved with the land trust, is, I like to say the Oak Ridges Moraine, you know when the pile of snow, and it's a really big one this year, that runs along your driveway, when it melts, you get that leftover rocks and sand kind of bit that you have to rake into your lawn or sweep up or whatever. The Oak Ridges Moraine is kind of like that, but on a massive level. And it was the two lobes that cracked and kind of ebbed and flowed, and water flowed. It's kind of that leftover bits and pieces. It's similar to what you get on your driveway, but on a massive glacial scale that runs 160 kilometers long. So a lot of that is sand. We also, if you've driven along the Oak Ridges Moraine, you probably see some of the aggregate pits. So that's the rock deposits. But we have a lot of sandy soil. Now that sandy soil is great because it's what allows the rainwater to infiltrate and recharge the aquifers. So the moraine is a source of water for, direct source of water for over 250,000 people. Plus it feeds, I think 65 lakes and rivers. That feeds even more water source. So the sand's really functional. But that also would have been home to this really unique habitat that would be really dry. It would burn, create that, post-burn habitat that the Kirtlands and a bunch of other species liked. That was very typical in this area as well. So yay, that's why we're involved. However, because we had these dry blow sands, we don't get that. Remember those pictures I showed you at the beginning? We do these plantations. We let them grow really, really, really big because you only harvest big trees. And we tend to get this kind of community, which isn't useful for not much. There's dog strangling vine, there's which is an invasive species, there's garlic mustard, because it becomes a very undiverse understory. There's not a lot of diversity, there's not a lot of different species in there, and so the invasive species tend to get a good foothold. So because we do a lot of plantations, and planting trees is great, but then we do nothing and let them grow, there's not much management, we end up not getting that nice native understory that happens. So we have all these great diverse pine oak communities, and we've stopped the fire, we're not managing them right, so they kind of just grow into these dull things that you're looking at on the screen. And if you've ever tried to bird in any of these areas, these old plantations, it's eventually when they get big and they start falling down, or say red pine decline comes in, you get openings and you get some more deciduous trees in, you get a little bit of diversity. But if you've walked into a stand at this age of red pine or Scotch pine, which is another invasive, it can be a little boring for diversity on all kinds of levels. So unfortunately, we had opportunity, but we've kind of just let it turn to this. So that's what's happening right now. Down in the States, another picture, like who doesn't love this bird? Isn't it beautiful? They've spent 60 years bringing this bird back from literally the brink of extinction. That's a lot of effort, but it's a great story. There are over 5,000 individuals. There are populations in Michigan and Wisconsin, and now potentially in Ontario. Well, it already has been, but I'll keep that as a surprise. As I mentioned, it was delisted in 2019. This is a conservation dependent species. So because we're not allowing these 85,000+ hectare fires happening every 60 years, that habitat is probably never going to become a natural thing in the limited range in the Great Lakes. Them and us being here and the development and all that, it will always be dependent on our health. And so will a lot of the other species associated with this habitat. So you have investments made by the US government to delist this bird. And they have pots of money for doing that. But once it's delisted, what happens to that money? What happens to the effort? So some people think that what's going to happen is they stop doing the management, the bird starts plummeting again, and then, oh, back on the endangered, here's more money. We don't want that to happen. Here is a look at the singing males. So this is 1951. You can see where they dropped really, really low. You can see that 167 in the 70s, and then up to 2015, we're over 2,000, and then they exponentially get bigger, which is great. So that management helped them from extinction, but how do we stop them from going back down when we stop managing them in the States? So we need to expand their population, and that's what we're going to do up here. But in Michigan, the work that they did to bring them back from 167 to 5,000 was to set fire to things. What? Again, fire is so, so important. So they would do selective harvesting and then burn. They started doing the harvesting, and they found out that the males, once that population hit that, I guess it was a sweet spot, if you will, they started moving away from the fire-created habitats into the managed plantation or tree farms, if you will, type habitats. So they got a little less picky as their populations got bigger. And so that was possibly the move to red pine, or maybe they always did have red pine in their breeding repertoire. But fire still is very, very important for them. It's important for so many species. It reflushes and it just resets that ecosystem, and it releases the nutrients into the soil. It can get rid of invasive species. We did a controlled burn at one of our properties. Wow, it was so cool to see. And what it does is it'll actually burn off some non-natives that aren't adapted to fire because they weren't from a fire system, every 60 years, 85,000 hectares. So it helps get rid of invasive. It also helps reset the plants that are dependent on it, and they need that fire. So this form of management, it's helping obviously with the Kirtland's warbler, but it's becoming a very useful tool right across North America. And it was something that the Indigenous communities knew, and they did that. They did it to help their food sources. They helped to control, they didn't want to get caught in uncontrolled fires. Obviously, that's not good. So they did it as a management tool. They knew that a fire led to certain, what's the word I'm looking for, edible food. So that helped kind of with the sustainability, not only for them, but for the whole ecosystem. So they were a big part of that. Now we're going, hey, what a great idea. We should have been doing this. So we're using it as a tool for ecosystem management, and it's very effective, not just for the Kirtlands. So down in Michigan, massive areas that they did to get this population up. As I said, they're trying to recreate those huge, massive areas of fire. But can you see all the little holes in this planting? So those are intentional. It wasn't just someone from space doing some weird pattern. They do those because that is what the habitat would look like after a fire. You get the flush, but you'd also get some open bald spots, if you will. And those are just as important to the Kirtlands as the dense understory and those thick, thick stems. So when they're doing a plantation, rather than just burn it and let nature do its thing, when they're doing a plantation habitat, they purposely put those gaps in because they're mimicking that fire. And so I'm not sure about this exact site, but it's similar to something that would actually be harvested by a forestry company. And a lot of the management efforts in Michigan had forestry products or forestry companies involved with it. So it was a different way to manage that habitat. So kind of cool. And if you ever are taking a plane and you get the opportunity to kind of go down and over Michigan, keep an eye out for this, because it's something you could probably see from space. So they started to get those back up, and technology came along, and they started doing these transmitters on them. You guys might have heard of the MODIS, and I can't think of the acronym right now, but it's a form of transmitter, and there's towers all over the place that the little signals bounce off, so they can better track bird movements than the traditional band, and hope you recapture the banded bird, because they can get more information off this than they can with a whole lot of banded birds that you just have to hopefully recapture. So this is a great move in technology, and it's allowed us to better understand Kirtlands as well as a ton of other birds. So they started tracking them. Here's my bad attempt at whoa, you're not going to believe this, but are there really Kirtlands in Canada? So if you were to look at I think it's the 2006 Species at Risk Federal Recovery Plan, it's a little, there wasn't a lot. They didn't have a lot of hope. They weren't really sure if they were up here. There was a total of 76 records ever. It wasn't seen as a big thing up here. They weren't sure. There was a breeding records at CFB, Canadian Forces Base, Harrison, Petawawa, which is up on the just south of the border of the Ottawa River between Ottawa and Quebec. They were, I think, first spotted there. The records go back to 1919. And they've been sporadically there. So why there? Well, they like to breed on the areas where they blow up stuff and do ammunition testing, because that mimics a forest fire. So occasionally I guess they'll go out and blow something up, and then a few years later it starts to flush, and oh, Kirtland's is like, yep, there's my habitat. So they've been breeding there for a while. In the 70s, a forester whose name is, this is why I have to take notes, Paul Aird, that's it, started looking for them, and he found them breeding still there, and then the records went back to 1919. Well, there's a scattering, maybe one or two a year, but they've been breeding there for quite a while. And then just north of there, across the river, there was a town in Quebec, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce the name. There were some records there, a few scattered ones up along the Bruce, you know, the usual sightings at Peely if you're down there, and oh, it's the Kirtlands, and everyone rushes to wherever it's found, a little kind of rogue bird going. But generally, breeding in Canada, wasn't really anything to write home to. There was a study done, and they assumed, because of Michigan, that north of Lake Ontario, and they worked, Peter Burke, who's been leading this charge in Ontario with bringing Kirtlands back, did some analysis, and they looked at the jack pine forest with forestry company records and, you know, aerial mapping. And they mapped out all these areas that were going to be just perfect for Kirtlands, and they didn't really get anything. So I think this is where they're like, oh, hey, we didn't think about red pine, because it wasn't really an option at that point. Turns out that there was other areas that they wanted to be at. So I'm just going to show you why, you know, the hope for breeding in Ontario was a little at the beginning. So the Breeding Bird Atlas, so this is a 5-year program that runs every 20 years, and there's the whole of Ontario, which you can see in the lower one, is divided into these squares. Every square has a square head, I call them, because I am one, that you go and you have to confirm as many birds and the highest breeding evidence. You have set surveys, set protocols, all that. So it gives you a baseline every 20 years of what's happening with our bird communities. If you guys have ever heard the term canary in a coal mine, birds are representative of what's happening out in the ecosystem and the quality of the environment that we're also living in. So here's the Kirtland's Warbler Breeding Bird Atlas. Oh, I think there's a little dot, yeah, right down there. Little one just at the top of Simcoe there, but it's pretty up in the northwestern, it's pretty bare, so not much. Where if you look at another bird, which is also a species at risk, not endangered, it's only, I think it's threatened or species of concern, the Canada warbler. So again, a migrating warbler, they're very similar in looks, habitat's a bit different, obviously. This one is also at risk, and look at the density of breeding evidence. So, Kirtland's, Canada, Kirtland's, Canada, quite a big difference. Here's the next one. So this is 20 years later. This is the 2001 to 2005. Again, Kirtland's. Oh, no, nothing. Not a single blip. Oh, there's Canada again. Ooh, look at that. Oh, oh. And this actually shows the ones where it's found on the first one. So you can still see that slight change in the population, but still quite frequently found throughout the area. So, you know, you can see why the kind of effort to look for Kirtland's warbler was a little, I guess, demoralizing. But there's good news. So, as I mentioned earlier, they were doing the MODIS tracking, those little tracking devices on the birds. I believe they tracked 6 in Bahamas, trapped them, put those on, released them. These little black dots are the MODIS towers. And these are the birds flying around southern Ontario. So even though here we are with this, nope, nothing on the Breeding Bird Atlas, they're here. They're flying around. Now, this is later on in the season, so these are non-breeding birds. These are the scouts. So what happens is, because that habitat changes, is that the birds that aren't rearing the babies, they're like, okay, guys, I'm going to go check out where we're moving to next. So they're out flying all around this, what would have been their natural range, looking for, forest fires, potential habitat. And so they're flying around all through Southern Ontario, even though we're not seeing them breeding, and they're looking for breeding grounds. But we're not finding them because there's no habitat, or there's not enough habitat. So as you can see on the map, there's the Petawawa population way up there, and they've been there for a very, very long time. Peter Burke, again, who's on our Ontario Kirtland Warbler Working Group, he was talking to different forestry departments, and he started working with Simcoe on their forestry department to help recreate that lost habitat. And then the Northumberland area is another area that we're looking at that has appropriate soils. Here's another sample. They're flying around. Like, they're all the way up to the tip, all the way up in Tobermory, Kawarthas. They've been, singing. They've been sporadically seen kind of through Cardinal-Alvar, but no breeding evidence. But they're absolutely flying around and scouting. Here's another one. This is from the federal government. Again, recent sightings. Not many confirmed breeding, and historic are the lighter gray, so they're just not around. Another look at citizen science. This is year-round sightings, so this is during migration, and they're look at their big area, all through that Great Lakes area, and then right down to Bahamas, one in Dominican, and back up. And then the Canada warbler, the distribution, another species at risk, again, totally different. So I'm just trying to show you the extreme of how rarely they're seen. Oops, spelling mistakes, sorry. Here you can see the tip of Michigan up here. And this is the dense part on kind of the middle left. This is where the populations are concentrated, some up in Wisconsin, but again, in not really a lot in Ontario. Canada warbler, that's all over. So here's looking. We're not seeing them. We have no records of them, but we know they're flying around everywhere. What's going on? We have the right soils. We have the soils that can sustain these pine oak communities, but there's just no habitat. So you can see that outline is the moraine and the green belt, and a lot of that area is across the moraine. So is there potential? Of course. We have these conifer plantations that are pretty dead and from a biodiverse level at this age. So what if we were to restart them? We can use that wood, we can use sustainable wood, and we can start from the scratch and make a better habitat, one that's more similar to the one that would have been here before we got rid of it. That pine oak community that was rich in diversity and understory and density and all that. So it is possible. We can take these somewhat dead conifer plantations, use the wood sustainably, and start from scratch. This is what we're aiming for. This is the early successional pine oak, even though there's spruce in there. The type of understory would be bearberries, sweet fern, bracken fern, the blueberries, which I mentioned are important. There's a lot of other species. The restoration targets between 85 and 120 different species. This is what we're looking at. So if you look at the base, the understory of this picture on the right, not really great. Look at that. You're establishing that undergrowth and then doing the forestry. So this is the way we want to go. So back in 2017, they started a project in the museum site at Simcoe County, which is just northwest of Barrie, just outside of Barrie. It was a really bad site. It was on blow sands, Scotch pine, which is invasive, not really productive. And so it was a great site to kind of start from scratch. Get rid of the few kind of scattered invasive species that were there and start to create this really rich and diverse pine oak community that we want. And then the Packard Track in 2019, which is west of Barrie, near the little town of Utopia, which is kind of a cool name. So they set fire to it. And when you talk to the Graham, the head of forestry at Simcoe, he tells you about, well, that was fun because the wind shifted and the smoke went right over Barrie. And so it's a bit of a communication nightmare. It was completely under control. All these are. They had a bad accident with a controlled burn that got out of fire in the 80s, and it was not good. A life was lost, a lot of property was damaged. There's a lot of lessons learned. So these are very, very well maintained and controlled. But sometimes the smoke does get a little obvious. But they burned all this kind of dead standing. There was some dead pine, white pine. There was a lot of Scotch pine, which are again invasive, and they reset that ecosystem. And then on the bottom right, you can see that they went out and started planting those trees. But there's another view of it. Very cool. Some white pines that are fire tolerant. This is, I believe, the Packard site. This is 2 years later. I don't know where my dates went. They were up here so I could remember. You can see some charring still, but you start to see the green coming up. So there's been trees planted. And they also did that gap. It's not as pretty as the aerial I showed you from Michigan, but they're still doing that mixed planting, open areas. Okay. This is what it looked like, and there's my dates, in 2016. So those are Scotch pine, terrible trees. This is 2020. So see that understory vegetation starting to come up. Deciduous, it got a bit more diversity. And then here it is in 2022. Still doesn't look like much, but hey, the birds showed up. The birds they didn't expect them for about 5 years. So we were out on a site visit, I think, about 2 weeks before they were discovered, and laughing because what they do to call them in is they play the bird call so that if birds are flying over, they're like, hey. And so we joked about how we heard them, but it was just the recorder. And that's part of the restoration techniques. And sure enough, they showed up. So a little earlier, we're all holding our breath to see if, so typically the males come first, and they find the territory the year before, and then the females will follow. The females tend to be a bit pickier about their habitat than the males, and you guys could make your jokes about that if you want. So hopefully this year, with the males being there, that this year the females will be, all right, let's see what you got. And we'll maybe have some baby Kirtlands. So that's the progress. A little success story. So I'm going to play this video because them showing up was huge news. Again, we were hoping that maybe in 5 years they might show up, and then boom, just singing. And for the birders that got to see it, it was such a treat. So I'm just going to play this little video that was done based on this project. How do I share the sound now? We tested this out. I had it all figured out. Oh, there it is. Share sound. Okay. Hopefully you guys can hear it. All right.
These small migratory songbirds require large areas of young mixed pine and oak forests for nesting. The Kirtland's warbler builds its nests on the ground at the base of young trees, underneath the low branches. When people started to manage forests and fight forest fires, forest ecosystems changed. With fewer large forest fires, there are fewer areas of young trees growing back, and less habitat for the Kirtland's warbler. Over the last several decades, significant conservation efforts have been made internationally to recover their population. In 2017, Southern Ontario's Simcoe County joined these efforts by creating breeding habitat for the Kirtland's warbler. and 2 years later began a second project on another tract of land. The creation of these new breeding habitats has helped the Kirtland's warbler return to Canada. While the Kirtland's warbler is still endangered in Canada, thanks to international and Canadian efforts, they have begun to recover.
Anybody else get weepy-eyed watching that? And I've seen it several times. It's so awesome. It's such a great story. And you can hear it's really distinct call, so it is loud. So even if you don't see them, you can usually hear them. So that was a feature. So the project, I mentioned Peter Burke, but I got a text from Dave saying, don't forget Ken Taninga. So Ken did work with the federal government for years, and he helped with the Kirtland Warbler, the recovery plan and all that, and he's working with us. This, because of all the different aspects involved in what this recovery and all the efforts, we need a really diverse group of people. There wasn't one organization or one group or one company that could really handle it all. So, you know, I say we as the Oak Ridges Moraine Land Trust, but it's we as in all these partners that are involved, and I'm sure more will come on. So we're working with Ben Walters at Fleming College, a brilliant forester. He's a birder too. He's doing his PhD on forestry and birds. He really knows his stuff. Peter Burke is with GEI Consultants. We're even working with the American Bird Conservancy. So there's a lot of effort down in the South, like in the States, because birds don't know political boundaries. So recovery of the population requires more than just, we got it done in Michigan. So they want to make sure that the migration and those, you know, going between countries, that the population is secure. So they're working with us, and they have a lot of expertise, and they're also members of the U.S. Kirtland Warbler Conservation Team, which are helping us. Mary Gartshore, who is, I mean, I heard about her when I first started, 20 plus years ago. She is the ecological restoration guru of Ontario, and she's helping with us. We've got Simcoe and then NCC as well, Nature Conservancy. So it's a very diverse group. We need a better name for our group because the Ontario Kirtland Warbler Working Group I find really dull. If anyone has any ideas, throw them in the chat. But it's really important that we bring all these expertise and all these talents to the table to make this project a reality. So here's us out at the Packard site, May 12th, and I think they found them on the 31st. So we just missed them. And there's, oh gosh, who's all there? Pete and Dave and Ben and Graham and Isabel and Sue and me and everybody. So, you know, we're a team. This is a team effort. And it, as I mentioned, at least 6 males, 5 to 6, I think. It was hard to tell. They moved around a lot. Came back. So yay, applause. This is great news. Remember I showed you that the only records are 76 records ever? And we almost get 10% of that in 1 year at one site. So this is pretty epic. And so here is the Packard site. And this is a video I took of them singing. Can't see them, of course. So really amazing that they're here. So this is great. We got Kirtlands. We're restoring this lost habitat. It's, you know, international collaboration, all these partners. Oh, this is great news. It's not just the Kirtland's warbler. This is kind of the umbrella species. There are so many other species that will benefit from this, including us, especially the birders. So here's just a look, and you can see the area circled is roughly where the moraine or where the area we're focusing is. The density of priority bird species, so ones that are threatened and that, you know, or indicator species of lost habitat or environmental conditions, there where we're going to be working is area where they're really high density. So we're helping to support that. Here are some of the birds that will benefit from the habitat. Quickly, I want everyone to tell me what they are. No, just kidding. So we've got brown thrasher, clay-colored sparrow, towhees, blue-winged warbler, upland sandpiper, grasshopper sparrow, field sparrow, whippoorwill, which is a threatened species, and its populations are kind of going down fast. It's not good. Savannah sparrows, brown-headed cuckoos, short-eared owl, which is another threatened species, and everyone's favorite, the indigo bunting. It's a niche species, but it works too, and it's the gateway bird. People go, whoa, that's a cool bird, and next thing you know, they're addicted to birding. So a lot of species will benefit. This is just a few, and these are just the birds. There's all the diversity of insects, the plants that we're bringing back to the landscape that aren't really common anymore. We're getting rid of invasive species. This is like an ecosystem project. We're bringing back lost ecosystems, which is pretty amazing, and it's very important. But wait, there's more. So those are some of the birds. These are just species at risk. So species that are declining populations. They're either threatened species of concern or endangered in Ontario and some of them Canada too. These are ones that will also benefit from this habitat restoration. That's a pretty good list, and it is not comprehensive. Because of the oaks, and there's going to be some beech trees, there's habitat for red-headed woodpecker, snakes. Even though we don't like them, they're very important. Our bats benefit from them. There's our bumblebees, the mottled dusky wing, another endangered species. So a lot of things that will benefit from the start to the kind of maxed out age, if you will, and then the reset, that whole succession of growth of that ecosystem on that short cycle will benefit all of these guys. And they've lost that habitat, a lot of them, which is why they're on here. Here's another cool one. This is extirpated from Canada, which means it's no longer found here, but it's still found in other areas. So it's not extinct yet. Here you can see it doesn't show up well, but there's a white dot around the area of the moraine, and that is also the historic Carter blue butterfly range. And so they are also going to benefit from this type of habitat restoration. So we might bring a bird back to Canada that's been extirpated. So lots of things to benefit from this project. And here's the great news, not the best picture because I had to kind of steal it off the appraisal report. We hope to get better ones. But the Oak Ridges Marine Land Trust, with help from our wonderful sponsors, has just closed on February 27th. 195 acres in Northumberland of property that will be restored for the Kirtland warbler in this pine oak savanna. So even if the Kirtlands don't show up here, there's all these other species that'll benefit, but hopefully the Kirtlands will show up too. That'd be amazing. It's right next to the Ganaraska Forest, which is another important element because their open areas would still be next to forests. So that's part of their life cycle as well that I didn't mention. It's going to be farmed. That keeps it so-called clean from weeds and invasives coming in. And we will start restoration, but there's a lot to be done. We have secured this property, but we're still fundraising for stewardship money, restoration money and everything. So if you'd like to help with the site and with this effort, please donate. We have had some amazing donations, and these are some of our sponsors and supporters. The Maple Cross Fund, who were helping lead this. So thank you. And if you live in Aurora, you can see them on the front page of the Auroran. They've done amazing things right across Canada. The Ontario Land Trust Alliance, this is some of their funding programs with the federal government. The Echo Foundation, the Sitka, the Maclean, and Bird Studies Canada. And so when the people went to visit, if you went out to visit the Kirtlands this past summer and you donated, that money was collected and that went in to support this project and the purchase of this first property. So thank you for Bird Studies Canada and OFO and everybody that's involved with that, and for everybody that donated when they went out to see them. So this is going to be the future home with the endangered Kirtland's warbler. And since it's no longer endangered in the States, we're going to have to talk to our U.S. colleagues about getting that sign up here. Right, Dave? So how can you help? Besides donations, which are always welcome, we're looking for seed collectors. So right now we have these areas to restore to these native plants, but because a lot of the native plants have been removed or gone because of that unique ecosystem being lost, having a seed source is not readily available. So we are starting some projects to get volunteer seed collectors that want to help collect native plant species, and we will be doing training for those. We just got funding for a senior seed collector project, which is 55 and up. So it's not just the 65 and older. And that's a project to try and keep our older members of the community, and I just realized that I'm going to be one of those soon, that to get them out and active and supporting. And so we've got that project coming on. If you're interested in volunteering for any of this, or you want more information, the link's there. It's a bit hard to click on your webinar screen, but if you just go to oakridgesmoraine.org and go to the Explore tab, you can scroll down and you'll see there's a Kirtland Warbler dedicated page, and the links are all on there. So this is ways that you can help. And if you are involved with the seed collection, whether you're young or old, it'll really be great because you'll start to learn the different native flora and fauna and the specifics about it. So that's an upcoming volunteer program. And as I said, we're welcoming donations as well. But as we progress through this, the restoration beyond just seed collection, we're going to have a lot more engagement and involvement. And some of the engagement they've done down in the States with this type of stuff is just really inspiring, and it's a lot of fun. So if you're interested in volunteering, even if it's not seed collecting, we're still collecting names, and we would love to have people that are keen and interested and want to help with this great initiative come out and have some fun with us. And if you build it, they will come. Yay! And that's what happened in Simcoe, and hopefully this will all happen in Northumberland and some of the other sites. So thank you for listening. Thank you for taking interest in the Kirtland's warbler, and for listening to me talk for that long. So thankfully, there's only one question. Good, I was worried I would get grilled on stuff. Okay, I joined late. Hi, Ron. Do they migrate when it's winter? Yes, they do. So I can go back. They actually migrate to the Bahamas, lucky ducks. They usually leave, I think, end of September. Somewhere around there with the other groups of warblers, and they go right down to Bahamas, a few outliers on some of the other islands nearby, but generally they consider them, like all of the population, to be in Bahamas, and tend to be in the middle islands because they're less populated and they have a lot of that kind of disturbed, post-disturbed scrub that they enjoy. So that, I don't know if there's any questions. Oh, good. Thank you for posting that link. Oh yeah, pinery. So I forgot to mention that, I don't know if you guys remember, I can't remember, I think it was 2019, there was a huge fire up in the Perry Sound. So Sue, I think you're up in that area now, right? Sue and Mark. But there was a massive fire, and it was an uncontrolled wildfire. So there's a difference between forest, like managed fires, and then the wildfires. Those are problematic. But there's jack pine up in that area. So there's kind of a fingers crossed. They've done some initial looking, and because such a large area was unfortunately burned, there's a good opportunity to come out of that devastation that this habitat might flourish, and we might get breeding birds up there because they have tracked them in that area. So there might be an unmanaged Kirtland warbler habitat popping up that way. So if you're in that area where there was a fire, when you start to see the green shrubs to be about between 5 and 15 feet, I look like, because I'm picturing it, start listening for that call. It's pretty distinct. Oh, now we got some questions. Yeah, we're going to do red pine in Northumberland. We're still working. So the restoration plan, we have to get out on the site once the snow melts, which should be soon, if not already. And do a proper assessment. So we kind of have the general restoration approach, but we need the site-specific details for it. But red pines will be the preferred because that seems to be what they prefer up here. So they did a survey up where there's jack pine dominated areas and didn't have much luck. So they seem to be really liking the red pine. So that's probably what we'll do. And it's, as I mentioned, it's also got that higher and better value for forestry. So if we do a reset down the road, that can be used for sustainable products, which is a good way to do it. Carolyn from NCC, How large is the Packard property? So I forgot to mention that the size, the minimum size that they're looking at, that they've seen down in Michigan and in Wisconsin, is 30 hectares. So, you know, going back to those every 60-year fires where you had 85,000 hectares burned, they tend to like these big areas. But down at the minimum size that they've had success with is down at about 30 to 35 hectares of that specific habitat. In Packard, I believe, the area where they were, so there's different sections. They tend to have a rotational management to kind of keep that preferred habitat available over a large area. And they're starting that at Packard. But the area they were in, I believe, was 31 hectares. And is there any follow-up control needed for Scots pine? Absolutely. There is a lot of invasive species management involved with this. There was one record in Canada of them breeding in Scots pine, but I think it was just desperation. We've all been there, slept on the couch, you know, there's nothing else, so we'll do that. But yeah, Scots pine's definitely on there for invasive control, as well as bachelor button. What are they called? The bachelor buttons, DSV, the typical ones that can wander in. But Scots pine is the enemy for this kind of stuff. We want the natives only. That 30 hectares wasn't the entire property. It was the section that was restored that the birds are in. So just to clarify. All right. I'm just checking. Michigan. Yeah. How many? So I'm reading the comments from Kathy. She's from Michigan. Great. So how often do you get to see them, Kathy? Like, how neat would it be to have them in your backyard? Apparently they're like 20 minutes from the border with Sault Ste. Marie in Canada. You can go see them. We're hoping, sorry, I just got something in my eye. We're hoping to do a visit down there in the team. I'm reading Dave's messages too, to see what they're doing down there firsthand. Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, the target species between 85 and 120 different plant and tree species that were being used. So the key part is, rather than just plant the trees, you have to have that understory, that diversity in the understory. So it has to be seeded. So if you notice in the video, you can see them casting seeds. Without that diverse understory of native plants, it's not going to work. And so that's a big part of it. And that's why the seed collection is so important, and why we're looking for volunteers, is because we need to find 85 to, I think, 120 different species of native plants that will thrive in sandy soils in that habitat. And that's very important for them, and everything else relying on that habitat. Oh, you've color banded over 100. Awesome, Mike. How cool. I was excited when I saw one, and you're like, get to see like over 100. Great. So hopefully some of those bands will show up. And I believe there was one from the Petawawa site that was also recaught down in Michigan. So I guess they move around quite a bit. Thanks, Dave. Seed collecting is a fun thing to do. Yes, super fun. All right. Still get excited. I'm so excited to hear them again this year. All right. Well, thank you everybody for coming out tonight, and I hope we'll see you out with some of the work we're doing. You know, if you're on our email list, we'll keep you posted. And if you have any questions, you can get hold of me. My email's there, and yeah.